What if Africa had never been colonized? Welcome to this thought-provoking journey where we question not just history, but the alternate reality that could have shaped our modern world. What if Africa had never been colonized by European powers? How would Africa and the world look today, especially the nations that benefited from colonization? To understand what could have been, let's first revisit what was. Colonization of Africa officially began in the late 19th century during the infamous Scramble for Africa, where European powers divided the continent amongst themselves for resources, markets, and power. Countries like Britain, France, Germany, and Belgium exploited Africa's human and natural resources, leading to systemic changes that still affect the continent. This history isn't recent. Slavery, resource extraction, and cultural suppression laid the foundation for vast wealth creation in Europe, wealth built at Africa's expense. But what if this story had unfolded differently? Before colonization, Africa was not the dark continent that many colonial narratives described. It was a vibrant land, teeming with powerful kingdoms like Mali, Zimbabwe, Benin, Ethiopia, and the Congo. These institutions had flourishing trade networks, academic centers such as Timbuktu, and cultural richness. Without colonial interference, Africa could have charted its own course in industrialization and modernization. Trade was already flourishing via routes along the Gold Coast, the Nile, and the eastern seaboard. What could Africa have achieved if left to develop its own technological and geopolitical systems? European colonization often eradicated or diminished native cultures, languages, and religions in favor of Western norms. In our what-if scenario, indigenous African cultures could have remained intact, passing on traditions and finding ways to modernize while preserving their unique identities. Imagine a world where African art, languages, and ways of knowledge were a dominating influence globally rather than being categorized under exotic or folk traditions. The preservation would not only benefit Africa, but would also provide the world with a true third pillar of global cultural influence alongside the East and West. Could Africa have industrialized on its own timeline? The answer hinges on the trajectory of pre-colonial trade networks and the wealth of resources like gold, diamonds, and fertile land available even then. Without the exploitation by foreign powers, African societies might have invested in their own transportation systems, medical research, and innovations. Entirely new advancements could have been pioneered from Africa's challenges and solutions. Railways and other transportation built for the sole purpose of extraction might instead have connected emerging modern African cities. Would Africa have had the next Thomas Edison or Marie Curie? It's possible. The uncolonized Africa hypothesis also shifts the global balance of power. A strong, independent Africa might have wielded significant influence in global geopolitics. Regional alliances, or a unified Africa, driven by trade and cooperation rather than division, could have paralleled or rivaled Europe and the Americas. What if African nations sat as dominant players in institutions like the United Nations from the start, or even reshaped the global economy with African-led financial institutions? Such movements could have presented the West with equal counterparts on matters of war, trade, and diplomacy. The economic consequences extend far beyond Africa itself. Much of Europe's industrial advancement was financed by wealth stolen from Africa. Imagine European economies without the influx of African gold, diamonds, rubber, and other resources, forcing them to rely on local or alternative sources for growth. Without the extraction-based economy, Africa might have diversified earlier, focusing on industries beyond raw materials. This could have made Africa a net producer of manufactured goods, fostering trade with other regions or establishing Africa as a formidable economic giant early on. No colonization also hints at a world with a minimized or eradicated Atlantic slave trade. This devastating event, which stole millions of Africans, would be notably absent, greatly impacting the populations and futures of both Africa and the Americas. Communities across Africa would have retained populations that could contribute to their homeland's growth rather than being forced into slavery in distant lands. Meanwhile, the Americas themselves would have developed differently without plantation economies reliant on enslaved labor. Uncolonized Africa could have created its own systems of governance, ones not imposed based on foreign models of monarchy or democracy, but adapted to African realities. This might have cultivated leadership that retained power responsibly and strengthened national integrity. Similarly, education might have centered on Africa's needs and realities. Universities focused on African studies, science and philosophy could have produced thought leaders whose ideas would enrich the global intellectual marketplace. Think of towering African figures shaping world history alongside the likes of Newton and Einstein. The ecological devastation caused by European resource extraction, clear-cutting forests, overmining minerals, and exploiting agricultural lands might not have taken place on the same scale. African resources could have been used sustainably to serve domestic development rather than fueling industries abroad. Africa's rich biodiversity would likely be in a much healthier state today, with thriving forests, preserved wildlife, and natural beauty that continues to awe in ways unparalleled anywhere else on Earth. How would two world wars, where African soldiers and resources played key roles, have differed without colonization? African nations' direct involvement might have been limited, or they could have entered the wars as neutral or allied powers, instead of colonies brought into battles that weren't their own. This raises deeper questions about how Africa could help stabilize or destabilize the global order. Would the wars have occurred in their known forms without Africa's involvement? It's a potent question. The vibrant traditions of untouched African civilizations could have rendered Africa a beacon for global tourism, akin to Asia's cultural heritage sites. Ancient kingdoms, preserved cities, and thriving festivals might have influenced global arts, design, and traditions more directly. Imagine African philosophies and traditions driving important global discussions about humanity, morality, and life, becoming a more prominent influence in shaping a collective human culture. The African diaspora story would be fundamentally altered. Mass migration prompted by slavery and colonial economics could have been replaced with more voluntary and diverse movements. African expatriates might populate the globe not as a response to necessity, but to foster international exchange on equal footing. How different would the lives of millions of African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, and Afro-Europeans be if their ancestors had never been uprooted? How would this affect racial narratives and inequalities in places like the United States or Brazil? Uncolonized Africa might not only change African contributions, but also augment the global cultural landscape. The music, films, literature, and cuisines we interact with today reflect colonially influenced dynamics. What missed masterpieces might have emerged in an uncolonized Africa? Our entertainment industry might look very different if African languages and stories existed as dominant narratives in global media. Of course, independence alone doesn't guarantee success. Regional conflicts, power struggles, or resource mismanagement could have arisen even without colonization. Would internal wars have emerged over borders, trade, or ideology, given an entirely different political structure? Still, in this hypothetical, such challenges originate within Africa itself instead of being imposed externally. A subtle but monumental difference in how nations resolve issues. In reflecting on what might have been, we see remarkable opportunities for Africa, and by extension, the world. What holds Africa back today may not merely be history, but the underestimation of its potential to rewrite that history going forward. What do you think? Would an uncolonized Africa have led to a utopia, or would new challenges have taken its place? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for journeying into this alternate reality with us. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video if you found it thought-provoking. It's these conversations that allow us to critique history and imagine better futures for everyone.